So I'm Dr. Craig Weiner, and this is the Chiropractic Zone, but really this is a transformational dialogue, and we've been doing these for I think 8.5 years now, so a long time. And you know, really the purpose for me of having these, number one, is very selfish, because I get to really know a lot more about things I didn't know, right? So it's a source of ongoing information and knowledge and learning for me. And I like to share. And so basically we get to have kind of a big living room space here. And they actually first started in this particular format when I saw Bruce Lipton and Rupert Sheldrake sharing a stage together, and they pulled up 2 big sofa chairs. They didn't have a glass of wine that night, but that's how I pictured it. I pictured it literally in a living room with a fireplace going more in the background, and 2 people that hadn't gotten a chance to really sit down and talk other than maybe say hi at a conference, and really get to have a conversation, and us in the audience felt like we were just in that space. So that's really how they started. So tonight I get to share with you and spend more time than I've gotten to spend with Catherine Van Wetter. She's a licensed social worker, and she's been involved in something called family constellation work for about 15 years. Came to the island back and has been really weaving her web amongst people that are wanting to find out more about how we can heal intergenerational trauma and how the past affects the present and hence the future. And so this is going to be an interesting evening, and as always, there's not an absolute set plan. The questions will come as they emerge. So I know that, well, first, welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
And secondly, I know you'd like to start us off with a little something quieting.
So much of the work I do also integrates sacred ceremony and ritual. I've had the opportunity to train with indigenous tribes. So what I would like to do is just, if you feel comfortable or your eyes open, just to take a nice breath in and allow the breath to go deep into your belly. And as you do this, just for a moment, if you would imagine standing behind you on your right is your father, and standing behind you on your left is your mother, irregardless of anything that may have happened, just allowing their energetic signature to stand behind you. And imagine standing behind your father, your paternal grandparents, grandfather to the right, grandmother to the left, and standing behind your mother, your maternal grandparents, grandfather to the right, grandmother to the left, and behind your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and on down the line of all those who came before you, trusting and knowing that you are the mere tip of the energetic signature of all those who came before you, and trusting and knowing that there is love here right now at this moment. Otherwise, you wouldn't be seated here. And so allowing that beautiful energy to come down through the generations, the love, the resiliency, to come down, coming into your heart, both back and front. And if you would, to imagine just turning and bowing deeply to all those who came before you, not in subordination to, rather in honoring of the greatest gift you ever received, which is the gift of life. And as you come up from your bow, turning and imagining that you're sitting back down. Thank you.
Nice.
I learned that from a shamanic healer from South America who said that in many tribes, indigenous, everyone knows where their place is, and that they know that behind them are all those who came before them. And many times we can walk this life feeling like there is no one behind us, and we can stand up without a backbone. And so this is bringing in the energy of those who came before us, and trusting and knowing that they're in every breath. We embody them. Whether we like it or not, we are our fathers, our mothers, and all those who came before us.
Very much like that image of the tip, and just seeing how far back and how large it gets, and then the tip is only temporary, isn't it?
Yes.
Right. Well, for some.
For some.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just go back a little bit. I know we're going to be doing a lot of going back tonight. How about we make it a little personal going back?
Okay.
Hi, welcome. Let's go back, not so much into your ancestors yet, but how about how did you get involved in family constellation work a little bit? And so your personal story of involvement, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what those words mean and what it is.
Well, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of disconnect on both sides of my family. And when I was 7, my sister died at the age, I was 7 and she was 4. And so growing up in a family where there was so much trauma and so much disconnect, there's an adage that you can never go home. And because of certain circumstances, I left home when I was 17. And when I look at my own children at the age of 17, I can't imagine them being out in the world like this. And I always wanted to go home, but it was never a possibility to go home because of who they thought I was. So 9/11, I was at the Chopra Center doing my own 9/11. And that was a pivotal point in my life when I recognized that if I could do my work from the inside out, not pathologizing my anxiety, my depression, my PTSD, my trauma, instead finding a way to really embrace it and honor it, then I could start moving forward in my life with an open, gracious heart. So when I was in graduate school, I studied, and to become a social worker, I studied Murray Bowen's work, who does family systems. And he works a lot with individuation and also attachment. And at the same time, I was being trained in systemic constellation work, Hellinger's work, which works with more of the spirituality, more of the soul of who we are. Whereas Bowen's is more the ego of the family. And I really resonated with the spiritual, with the soul part. And so that's how I started getting involved in it. It was for my own hunger and that place in me that felt so hollow. Didn't know where my place was, really didn't want to be here because of my sensitivity. And so through my own work of discovery and honoring and really working on unconditionally loving myself, I found that it brought peace in a place that I never had peace. So I wanted to extend it out into the world and do my very best to bring this world into, or this work into the light.
It so happens we share a lot, so my work currently in a different format, and EFT and others, is working with trauma. And it's been my experience and my observation that number one, we'll probably need to define trauma a little bit more. Okay. But for those who've experienced it to a significant degree, very often their calling in life is a movement towards healing that and then sharing that to the world. Yeah. So part of the overcoming. Does it feel that way to you?
It does. Yeah, it does. And I love, this is work of the soma, work of the body. And I love Peter Levine's work. For those of you who are not familiar with Peter Levine, he's watched the physiology of animals who have been traumatized or feel like they're threatened. And animals, when they are under attack, they're always looking to see where the danger is. They're looking to see where it is. And then when the animal comes out of it, they breathe it out and they shake themselves off. What I found is many times when we have trauma within our upbringing at that very young age, where it's helpless, many times hopeless. That trauma in and of itself is a natural phenomena that happens. When it gets coupled with hopelessness, that's when it becomes rigid within the body. And that's when we start, it goes into our cellular memory. It's interesting you talked about Bruce Lipton and also Rupert Sheldrake, because this is work of quantum physics and neurophysiology and all that awesome stuff. So working with folks who have been traumatized, and each and every one of us have been traumatized to a certain point. To be alive can be traumatic, going through the birth canal, working with folks, I'm sure you see different levels of it. And what I found with this work is as we go through trauma, sometimes we pathologize it. Sometimes we make it into an illness when PTS, and they're dropping the D from it because it really isn't a disorder, PTS, it depends on who you're speaking to, is a natural phenomena. So how do we normalize it? How do we witness someone with their trauma to say, I'm another you and you're another me, and let me hold the space, or at least create the space where you can release that which is not yours.
So just to circumnavigate and put a container, when she was speaking of Peter Levine's work and the stress and trauma, so elements, without going into pathologizing trauma either, inherent characteristics of trauma is, number one, is always based on perception. Yeah, so in other words, if you're 14 years old and somebody starts running at you, it's somebody running at you. If you're 3 years old and somebody's running at you, it's a very different perception of the oncoming. And so perception is continually how we live, and when traumatized, the sensitivity gets amped way up, so smaller and smaller things can set us back. And so, you know, what I love that you're speaking is you're dancing in kind of a psycho-spiritual trauma neurophysiological space, which perfectly adapts to many other circles of bodies of knowledge and study, within which healing includes a non-pathologizing and a sense of safety in a container. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what safety means for you within regards to this work.
What safety means for me is it's imperative for the health and the well-being of the individual that I'm working with, that no harm is caused. And what that means is when I'm working within a context of a circle, making sure that the individual who is working with me feels safe enough to do the work that they're doing. And that may mean that within a circle, they look at everyone in the eye to make sure that they're safe enough to do the work. Recognizing that as a facilitator, my job is to make sure to watch their physiology. I'm trained in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, so I watch people's physiology, I watch the breath, I watch their little small nuances, I watch to see whether they shut down. There was one client I worked with within a group whose father left when he was very, very young, and it embittered him deeply. And when we started doing the work, he closed his eyes. And so I stopped and I asked, what resource do you have? What's kept you here? Because many of us, if we've had traumatic lives, what's kept us? Is it God? Is it the divine? Is it our dog? Is it something that's kept us here? In this case, it was his dog who had passed. So I had him energetically bring in a resource to hold him, to support him, and asking him, what part of his story did he not want to see? What part was he afraid to see? And he was afraid to really be with the truth of the reality that he was living, which is father left. Little one was left behind. Little one turned his back on father. And so this work is about revealing the truth of what is, and within that, creating a container that is safe enough for people to be vulnerable, trusting and knowing that it'll set them free. And I'm still learning, being on the island, the dynamics are different than when I lived in Eugene, of how to do circles. So I'm continuously looking to improve, to get better at creating a space where people feel safe. And I recognize that as much as it's my responsibility, it's also people's responsibility within the circle to say, I don't feel safe. What can we do to help with that? So it's kind of twofold in people asking for what they need and then me as a facilitator being sensitive and intuitive enough to be able to recognize whether or not someone's shutting down. Did that answer?
It did. It did. I'm going to play a little obviously adversarial role for a second, just to. Why don't we just get over it? Right? And I say that playfully because I know the answer. But on the other hand, there is a meme-like thought.
Right.
Of get over it. It was 40 years ago. It was 60 years ago. It was when you were a little kid. You're an adult. You're a grandfather now. Why are you still carrying on to that? And I was just wondering if you could kind of speak into that way of thinking and kind of your experience of that.
Because your issues are in your tissues. Because we carry, whether we know it or not, we unconsciously start taking on the pattern of the trauma. So it becomes who we identify with. So I work in community mental health. I work with people who are steeped with trauma, steeped with different diagnoses that they've carried for a lifetime, and pharmaceuticals. And I find myself at times getting frustrated. It's like, we've spent the last 6 months talking about the same thing. What do we need to do different here? And what I found is when someone can be deeply heard without the attachment of anyone wanting to change them or put a label on it. When someone keeps repeating their story, my part as a listener is, what part of your story have I not heard? What part of your woundedness have I not honored? What part of you have not been honored for your sacrifice? And what I find is often people who carry trauma for a lifetime often are carrying more than what is theirs to carry. When I see someone who's deeply depressed, psychotic, suicidal, anxious, has disease, has illness, etc., I know that they're carrying something that's so much bigger than they are. So then it's honoring that part of themselves that was clever enough to stay. So an addiction, a behavior, a habit, an attitude, if we look at it with a positive intention, that it helped keep a person here. Addiction in and of itself can save people. In overuse, it can be very traumatic. Depression, when you actually look at the word of the depressing, because it doesn't feel safe enough to be exposed. So it's really it's going in some ways like a Sherlock Holmes of looking at the small nuances and also the loyalty that they may be carrying for those who came before them. How is it serving you? How is it that the story perpetuates itself? And how can we free you? Because people have loyalties to their trauma. Yes. It's like, I don't want to give up my trauma because it's something that I recognize. It hurts, it's painful, and it's something that's familiar. So then in and of that, how do we bow deeply to the trauma? And when I speak of bowing, it's so beautiful because in other cultures, we bow and our head goes lower than our heart, showing that our head is subordinate to our heart. Our heart is what guides us, and so the bowing is not in subordination to, it's an honoring. So bowing to the trauma, the great warrior that kept us here in some ways. And doing things like this, it's all of a sudden coming from that place of strength, because we live in such a discouraged society that perpetuates sometimes the trauma and the anxiety and the fear, to actually put it into a space of, I see you, I hear you. Are you ready to release? And sometimes it's within 3 to 4 sessions, other times it can go on for a few months of them releasing.
Well, we've been kind of circling around the idea of healing trauma, and we're going to go further into that. But let's, for those that have no idea what this circle is that you're speaking about in the form, can you speak a little bit to the form of constellation work, what that looks like, how it's created? And
so I'll explain what systemic constellation means to me. So Bert Hellinger, who coined the phrase systemic constellation work, was a Zulu missionary. He was a Jesuit priest who moved down to South Africa and lived with the Zulus for 15 to 20 years. And he was in the morphic field, the knowing field of the Zulus, who had their sacred ceremonies, who honored those who came before them, who looked towards the little ones, recognizing the importance of transition and the importance of rites of passage. And so when he went back to Germany, it was during the time in Nazi Germany that he became a psychotherapist, and found that more than 70% of the issues or situations that the clients presented themselves with was not due to pathological or psychological, rather it was systemic, in that things get passed on from generation to generation, and that history repeats itself without resolution. So with that being said, he pulled in from Virginia Satir, he pulled in from Moreno's work, psychodrama, he pulled in from Confucius, recognizing the importance of honoring the opposites to find the truth, the injustice, the justice, the victim, the perpetrator, love and hate, and all these in and of themselves have their place. And so systemic, everything is a system. So up in the sky, when we have the beautiful constellations up there and the stars are all in their right place, it's beautiful. When they're out of order, there can be chaos. Within our bodies, our organs and our cells are in their place, and when they're in their place, we're healthy. When they're out of place, then we can have disease. Within families, we all have our place. And within the context of this phenomena, it's phenomenological in that you can't wrap your mind around it. In this position, father is to the right, mother is to the left, and thinking in your own mind's eye of how your own family was, the oldest child to the left of the mother, and on down. When there has been trauma within a family that has continued to perpetuate itself, trauma of suicide, trauma of addiction. We see this with our veterans coming home who not knowing where their place is trauma. There's parts of a family that will turn their backs on their children. A child that doesn't have a parent because the parent has their own trauma, or a parent belongs to the clergy, or a parent that's a veteran, a parent that has suffered from mental, emotional, or physical disease, turns their back energetically on a child, on the family, and so the child becomes what we call parentified. They become the parent. Better me, mom, than you. Then they start taking on the trauma that is not theirs to carry. And so within the system, when the ego can be put in its place, and when someone can sit in a constellation, and I'll explain more, then the truth of their life begins to show up in the way that people stand to each other, whether or not they're repulsed, whether or not they want to come close, the directions in a circle where people are facing either out of life towards someone they love who may have passed, towards not wanting to be here. So it's just a beautiful way to start uncovering invisible dynamics. So the organics of the group is that we are in a circle. The individual who does work with me, I often refer to them as a facilitator, because we all facilitate their lives rather than the client. And I'm the cattle, or I'm the conductor. And so the person sitting in the chair is often the catalyst for what other people within the room may be experiencing. I speak to the individual before they do some work with me. We discuss what it is that they would like to work on, what sort of outcome they would have. Like, I don't have a good relationship with my mother, or my relationship with my partner is strained, or I've had chronic illness, I have immune deficiency. So anything we can work on. It's not just family, it's money, it's beliefs, it's attitudes. And then the individual and I will come back in the room, and within the context of the room, after looking around to make sure it feels safe for everyone to do their work, the person to do their work, then the individual will choose someone to stand in as what we call a representative. They will represent father, they will represent love, they will represent addiction, whatever it is that we're working on. And then the individual will have the person, the representative, stand up, place their hands on their shoulders, and lead them in the position that they see them in their mind's eye. Mm-hmm. And then from there, the circle starts taking on the energy, the knowing field of what it is that the person is representing. And I have no idea how this works other than I've seen it work like this for years and years and years. So mine are called illuminated. When I first learned how to do this work, everyone in the group knew what was going on. And because of the sensitivity of some of the people I've worked with, from ministers to organizations to doctors, I made it so, which kind of is hard because people don't always get it, I made it so that it's illuminated. We put light into an area that does not have light. And so the circle evolves and moves, and people say what I call soul statements. They speak, if this is true, I did not want you to leave. I felt abandoned by you when you left. And so these healing statements are ways to start getting movement, because this work is all about interrupted love. And as we were talking earlier, there's love here, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here. So this is the interruption of love, and how do we get the flow of love going again? Because part of the orders of love that Hellinger came upon was that everyone within a family has the right to belong, everyone. And if anyone has been excluded for any reason, they need to be re-included again, not only for the health and the well-being of the individual that was cast out, but also for the whole family, because families are always looking for homeostasis. Systems are. I'm noticing a lot of yawning. There's a lot of energy moving. Talking about some interesting things. And then the other order of love is reciprocity. Again, we go into opposites. The even give and take within a family of father, mother. Their responsibility is to give love to the child, and the responsibility of the child is to receive that love. If a child doesn't have children as they grow up, they give back in service by being in community. And then everyone has their place. Father to the right, mother to the left, and on down the line. So it's just a beautiful way to put things into order, into their right place. And once they're into their right place, we can put down what is not ours and live a life of joy irrespective of circumstance.
I like what you said, and try to think of the whole trauma as an interruption of love. Because within that statement, within the trauma, there's so much suffering and so much pain and variety of other emotions that go along with that for each person. But it's as if somehow it happened still in the context of the possibility of love that was interrupted somehow, whether it was intergenerational. And that's kind of the lineage of trauma. It is passed down. It is absolutely passed down. Study after study shows those who cause violence have had violence. And you know, I see this work as an interruption of that lineage. So the personal work that we do around trauma surely is about ourselves and surely is not.
Right. And you spoke about the part of this work, as I mentioned earlier, that Hellinger, it was during the time of Nazi Germany. Hellinger's belief was that if a victim could have compassion for a perpetrator, wow, what a concept, right? Especially if we think about how it is in the United States. Compassion, as the Dalai Lama says, is imperative for the health and well-being of all of us. Compassion is equal relationship with the knowing that the victim trusts and knows that the perpetrator themselves had been perpetrated against. And when there is that exquisite, true compassion, it allows not only for the victim to heal, but also for the perpetrator to heal. Right. And remember the incident that happened with the Mennonite years ago when the person came in and killed the children in the school. The Mennonites within the village, the selected ones, went to the funeral of the one who had killed those children. And it wasn't because, oh, look at how good we are. It was they recognized that if we don't put down the hatred and the anger and the rage, it'll go out into the field energetically, but it also causes us to be bitter inside. And so it's quite an invitation, and it can be difficult for someone to say, how can I possibly have compassion for someone who has caused me so much harm? And that in of itself is something that when somebody is so tired and nothing is working anymore, it's surprising that people who often are attracted to constellation work are the ones who don't know their place. They've had so much trauma, they've had abuse, there's addiction, there's mental illness, there's physical, all of the things that keep them from living a life of love and joy, for doing what their true purpose is.
Right.
So it's kind of ironic, if I may just share one little thing.
Yeah, please.
That here on the island, so I've been here for a year in March. I knew I had family here, but I had no idea how deeply embedded they were. And my family, my father and mother who lived over in Port Townsend, we didn't really have anything to do with the Van Wetters on this side. So now, from circumstances that have presented themselves, I found my second cousin, David, who's 17 years old, who was kicked out of his house when he was 12. All of a sudden, he's in my lap along with someone else. And so that's why the donations are going to Ryan's house, because they've saved him as far as I'm concerned. And what I'm recognizing is how difficult it is to break out of who people think we are. How do we say, I am not who you think I am? I know being raised, my mom and dad never knew who I was. They made up stories of who they thought I was. They had no idea. And with this precious David, and with so many people and so many youth, people don't know who they are. And so how do we break out of that bondage, that separation, that feeling of alienation and self-hatred? How do we break out of it and recognize that there's love? There's only love. And it's not a trite thing to say, all you need is love. Well, all you need is love. And a second chance, and a third chance, and the willingness to put down what isn't ours. It's not our children's responsibility to sacrifice themselves, so in magical thinking children do. We all do. We sacrifice ourselves for those who came before us. Better me than you. It's time to stop that so that we can recognize it's our birthright to live joyfully and to live effortlessly and to be loved and honored for who we are.
When I was speaking about that, we're not doing it just for ourselves, thank you, because you took it in the direction of the perpetrator, but actually the image I had was just when you started the evening and we looked at the triangulation of being at this point and the healing happening for ourselves, but for many that is just as wide forward. And so the healing of our own trauma because of the virality of trauma, how it shows up in mental health, addiction, disease, and every other way, just literally carries forward. So the healing of a single person has the potential for healing millions. And when I stop and think about that almost eyeglass-like figure, it's really phenomenal.
And there's a beautiful saying that the peace of the dead is dependent on the living, and the wellness of the living is dependent on the dead. So as we do our own work, those who have crossed over, we're doing the work for them and the 7 generations forward. And so by not doing our work, in some ways it's a selfish act. By stepping into the fire and letting it burn you up a little bit, that's the place of the true spiritual warrior, of doing their work. May I read this?
Sure.
So there's a beautiful picture up there on the wall of the tree that's been cut with the roots coming up. And I had no idea it was there. And so if you listen to these words, Bert Hellinger, the root is covered. It covers what will come to light later. The roots contain in a condensed form what already is but has not yet seen the light of day. The root nurtures, holds and carries the future growth which will emerge from it. And to go farther into that, Thich Nhat Hanh, I see my roots in my father, my mother, my grandfather, my grandmother, and all my ancestors. I know I am only the continuation of this ancestral lineage.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to, for lack of a better word, the magic, the serendipity, the unexpected, or maybe the ununderstood that happens in a circle? Because I know that happens, but maybe you can speak to some of what's happening. So you showed a little bit about the form of what happens in a circle, and actually, maybe before that, is this something that takes a whole day? What does that look like? And just a little bit more setup of what happens.
What happens? Well, I do all day, and I do weekends. So I'm going to be at the Fairy Congress, so I'll be working with the unseen fairies and the little ones that light up the sky. And I've gone out to places like Brighton Bush and have worked with the water that has come through. So within the circle of either 1, 2, or 3, it can last for a day or an evening. I do it on the phone, I do it individually, so it's dependent on what people are seeking. It's really beautiful when you have a full day, because then people really begin to connect. I like to think that they come in on the wings of grace and then they fly out on even bigger wings of compassion and love. And doing Illuminated, when people don't know who and what they are representing, it kind of has two folds to it. One, we do live in a culture that is very heady, and we try to figure things out. And many times our bodies can be like 40 blocks away from where our head is, not even knowing what's going on inside our body. And our body is a wonderful, as you know, a barometer of telling the truth. It never forgets anything that's ever happened to it. So if we ever want to know what's going on inside, we can have a little dialogue with our body. So the Illuminated is that people who stand in as a representative, not knowing who and what they're representing, get to access their own innate wisdom of how they take in things. They could sense things, they could feel things, they can hear things, and so that carries on out into the world when they're waking up in the morning wondering what the day's going to unfold. And then with compassion, people are often more compassionate, recognizing that our stories may be different, but the wounds we carry are very similar. Or if someone is representing a family member, they'll recognize that family member's a lot like the family member I grew up with who I didn't get along with. Wow. I kind of sense what it must have been like for them. So it's been said that the person sitting in the chair, being the catalyst, may have the intention of the sort of outcome they have, and they may get it, depending on whether or not their ego gets in the way. Everyone within the group walks away with something because they have no attachment other than being of service.
That's a useful role.
Yes, it is, to be of service.
Because the truth is that you can't, if you're playing somebody's grandfather, playing's the wrong word, but if you're representing the grandfather, intellectually I have no idea what your grandfather was like. So I have no idea how to be. Anything is made up. So there has to be, I would say, some sense of surrender. To a different way of knowing.
And it's tapping into it. So another example. I did a video with doing a mock constellation. Well, you don't do anything mock in this world. Everything is real, right? So the woman who was the representative, or the client, I knew a little bit about her history. And so she wanted to work on a family trauma that happened, which was her brother was in the Navy and was murdered. And they covered it up. And the family knew that he had been murdered. They knew that. All they wanted was some peace around this, some truth around this. So I had her set up her siblings on how she saw them, and she put 5 of her siblings so that their backs were all towards the center of the circle. Each one of them started taking on the mannerism of who it was they were representing. It was just like her mouth just like dropped open. And the person, her brother who was murdered, said, "I feel cold." And that's often indicative of death. Something. He said, "All I want to do is turn around and let everybody know that I'm okay." and the tears. And so what I know of this work, it's walking, it's the shamanic, there's some shamanism in this, that we walk in between the worlds, and that ancestors or the truth floats up like smoke, and the answers are there. And so the receptor who takes in the energy of who and what they're represented, afterwards when they find out what it is, it's like, of course. So we can carry things, and with that comes also there can be side effects, because we can take in the energy of who and what we're representing and not release it. So my practice has also been, I go through a clearing where people release anything from the constellation that is not theirs. And then making sure, and sometimes I'm better than not, making sure that they're as good or better than they were when they first stepped in.
So it's interesting because this really is a nexus of spirituality, of the really most cutting edge of neuroscience and epigenetic understanding, of family dynamics. So, I mean, it's a beautiful holding for wherever I would imagine the facilitator wishes to take it in a different direction, and there's a lot of room for.
Because every facilitator has their own gift that they offer. Sure. Some are very traditional and use Hellinger, even though he said he never wanted to certify people in this because he didn't want it to be dogmatized. Because the field is moving. The knowing field is moving all the time. Some facilitators are very traditional in how they're doing father-mother. Others are more open. I trained with someone where we studied with the Karo, and so bringing in Andean mysticism and Native American. Others don't. And so, you know, the invitation is step into the field of the facilitator, the knowing field, with respect, trusting and knowing that they're doing it. So yeah, it's a beautiful growth. I love the work so much. It speaks to me. It speaks to me at such a deep, profound level, I think more than anything I've ever trained in. And it's difficult to kind of explain it. So I appreciate the format that you're offering here tonight with asking very down-to-earth questions. And so I've been able to work on that because sometimes I can, whoop, but I always come back.
What surprises you in a circle?
Oh gosh, I get to be witness to a miracle. It's like a shift in perception. And I see it in somebody's physiology that they're starting to shift. It's like their heart becomes a little lighter. There's hope where there wasn't before. There's that empowerment that they are the masters of their boat. That just because, as Bruce Lipton says, there's a predisposition towards cancer or heart disease or suicidal ideation doesn't mean that you need to continue to perpetuate it. And so in that way, I'm always delighted and just like, tell me what you found out. And then years later, I get emails from people. I worked with this young man back in Oregon who was suicidal. We worked 3 times together. He wrote me several years later and said that the greatest gift I can ever receive is the gift of life. And he said, you gave me my life. You know, and my ego, it does not, I tried to get my ego in there before, like bow, and they said, I don't want to bow. And it's like, bow, because if you don't bow, I'm not going to look good. I can say that. So when I step in, I make sure I'm clean. I'm a clean vessel when I step in. I'm there only to be of service and not cause harm. It's not about me. And so being a witness to someone's dance, making sure everyone is safe within it, is beautiful. That's what delights me, is seeing that opening. And it continues to open. And then we have beautiful communities. People come together in circle, and oftentimes, even if it's just within the context of 2 hours or a day or a weekend, they will forever be in each other's field. They'll forever be Because when we give our hearts to each other and when we give to each other, there's a part of you that will integrate into me to make me a better person, and vice versa. So it's really, it's movement of the soul, and the soul moves much slower than the mind does. And it's a beautiful dance.
You bring up, I don't want to go too far, but to bring it back. So personal interest of mine has been what's called the science of memory reconsolidation. And it's a bigger question, but what it basically speaks to is what affects permanent change. Mm-hmm. Transformational change, as defined by some, is that there's no longer effort mm-hmm. in trying to be the new way, it's done. Mm-hmm. And there's no willpower, there's no return when things get stressful. One doesn't go back because mm-hmm. it's ceased to exist, so to speak. Right. And in that art of that science is many different methodologies that do it. Okay. And in one way, this feels like another. Mm-hmm. Because what they say is within that, there needs to be a witnessing of what happened, mm-hmm. a witnessing of the trauma, a reliving, remembering, however that is, often through the body. Mm-hmm. And then there's something new, mm-hmm. that both of them can exist simultaneously. So I'm coming around to a question, I know, but in that circle, is that what you see? In other words, somebody at least starting to witness the way that it was, the way that they've always seen themselves, the way they see the event that happened, if it was an event or a lineage of events. And then suddenly, through the eyes of others, through this very deep experience, is now witnessing it in a totally new way, mm-hmm. that once they have that understanding or compassion or other way of looking at it, they can't look at it the same way again, and it's mm-hmm. forever changed.
Right. So what happens is oftentimes people feel validated for the very first time. Because we're raised in families with beliefs, attitudes, behaviors that often we don't even question. And we go out into the world and live it like that. And we have secrets. All of us, I'm sure, have family secrets. And being the carrier of the secret is a burden. It is a burden. And so we sometimes forget who we are because of the story of who people think we are. Mm-hmm. When someone has the validation viscerally, this is not, curiosity, this is total heart. Viscerally, they feel it, and it's like I see it in their light. Either tears, oh my God, you see me. Wow, yeah, I felt that way, and they're just like that. So then it comes to an interesting point when I talked about putting the ego in its place, that when a beautiful constellation is done, part of it is I don't like to talk about it too much, because we all have our interpretation of what happens. We all have our own story, and especially with the individual who did the constellation, it's best not to hear, even to go out in the world and say, I did it, and when this is blah, blah, because we're running the risk of it being thwarted. So then they're at this pivotal place where they can either put down what is not theirs to carry, or they can continue to carry it. And so it really is at a place where they can decide. Is it easy? No. And it's funny because I say I often work with people 3 to 4 times and then they're good to go. They'll come back for a tune-up within a year or so, 6 months. It starts, the unconscious starts to come forward. And as you know, with unconscious patterns, when they begin coming to the forefront, we start seeing them. Oh yeah, we become the witness, the observer. All right, oh yeah, that extra cookie doesn't make me feel real good. I'm eating because I'm emotionally whatever. And so it's that deepening and that awareness and the recognition that we're not a victim, or if we were honored for our victim. And then we get to put it down. Does that explain? Does that answer your question?
Not exactly, but okay, it was still good. No, but it was still fine. Mm-hmm.
And this is part of it. It's curiosity. Yeah. What more?
I guess so. What I hear through you is the unfolding.
Right.
I guess that's most
and
poignant.
Some systems, as I'm finding out with my own, and how many years have I been doing this? 500-year plan. Mm-hmm. I still have several hundred years left. Is the entanglement.
You're getting there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it'll be deja vu when I come back. This is slightly familiar. Is in some ways patterns can be very sticky. So sometimes people can want to break out of a cycle and it's sticky. So then we keep going back to it once again, and it gets a little less sticky. Mm-hmm. So that story of walking down the street and there's a big hole in the ground, you fall in, you can't help it, you know, do it over and over, it's a habit, and finally you go down a different road. So the changes that I have witnessed are from the mouths of the people who have done the work, and they have no reason to fabricate and say, you know, that all is well when it might not be. I mean, it's all about the truth, right? So sometimes it takes a little longer because they're so entangled. Mm-hmm. Entangled in a way that is not real healthy, or their loyalty to not wanting to quite give it up. And since it's nonlinear, it could be within a day, a week, a month, or a year when all of a sudden you wake up and think, wow, I feel lighter, my heart feels better. Life is looking pretty good. I'm grateful for that. So it's nonlinear, there is no time.
How do people work with, within family constellation, the idea of past life versus generational?
Mm-hmm. I often don't walk in the realm of past life, mm-hmm. and I will use whatever semantics someone resonates with. Right. Because part of it is I get out of my own way without my lens of how I want it done. Mm-hmm. So, and the more I recognize that we come from many, many different lifetimes. Mine in particular has been generational. That can go back 20 generations, which is like a past life. So it's whatever language works for the person I'm working with.
Do you find, I would say the lineage, the intergenerational lineage that's carried as we become melting pots, mm-hmm. versus cultures which have remained generationally intact, mm-hmm. geographically? I'm just curious what you've witnessed. Is there a dissipation with a change of culture and nation, land? You know, if one had many generations in a particular culture, geography, and now find them, is there a dissipation? What is that process?
Well, it's interesting because we live in the United States, which in and of itself is a land of immigrants. Really. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Many of us have come from other places, and if we were to ask, where did your grandparents come from? I don't know. Somewhere. And so if someone, for instance, comes from Ireland, that's had so much trauma and so much sacrifice, down through the lineage, someone will be carrying huge depression, anger, and rage. And so as a land of immigrants, many people have forgotten who they are, where they've come from. And many therapies approach it from a psychological, or where someone goes to therapy and says, I didn't get what I wanted growing up, which makes a separation. Talk therapy, we can get really good at our story and have a 1,000,000-page documentation on why it is how we are and never change. And so part of this is really honoring our lineage. Where did we come from? And if we don't know, to look into our genealogy and recognize what we have been carrying throughout the generations. Native Americans with their high suicide, with their addiction, my sense is that they have not been honored for their sacrifice. We're seeing a whole host of veterans coming home with amnesia who have turned their backs. So not only and they're looking towards the ones who have not been honored, they're looking towards their family who is still out there in harm's way. So not only are we dealing with the veterans coming home with missing limbs and other atrocities, we also have the fracturing of a family. And so indigenous tribes are so beautiful because they don't forget where they've come from, and they don't abandon someone who is in pain. They're sitting next to them as they go through their grief. They're witnessing them, they're honoring them, they're talking to the ancestors for answers. Here we live in a culture, as you know, that's so isolated, that's so autonomous in our little cars and our little homes, and a lot of suffering with not coming together in community. I know the internet is important, but I love the gathering where we can share our voices and we share our stories through each other, and that reminds us, remembers us from where we came from, and the honoring of, and how we grew up as far as what our religious was. When I was growing up, I was so angry at God for taking away people that I loved, my sister, my dog, my friends. And it wasn't until I started practicing with the indigenous, in particular the Karo, that if I will always be a Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic, but it's in my genes. It's part of who I am. So it's identifying ourselves and not pushing away the parts, our father that we hate or our mother that we hate, or moving millions of miles away, because guess what? Wherever you are, there they are. So the more we can come to resolution and peace and compassion towards ourselves, the more I can look at you and say, yes, we are one. Same heart, same breath.
We've also seen, and I can't help but point to the separation of generations. Mm-hmm. For so long, the tradition of living multi-generationally mm-hmm. was such an intact piece of, I almost think it gives the opportunity, you know, when we get together with parents, grandparents, great-grandparents for a holiday, mm-hmm. for a day visit, or, you know, and I'm as part of my growing up as well, but never actually living with mm-hmm. grandparents, great-parents, and while there certainly are challenges with that, and interpersonal mm-hmm. ones, of course, there's a binding mm-hmm. and an enlargement of who we are in the basis of an intergenerational span mm-hmm. that I think has, we're in a time that's different than any other time.
And children who are raised without grandparents have a higher suicide rate, statistically. Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting that it gets passed on. NPR years ago had a beautiful segment on a white woman who adopted 2 African American children who obviously knew that they weren't black or they weren't white. And many adopted parents are afraid for their adopted child to look for their bio. Mm-hmm. Because they want to keep them safe, they're protected. Yet we have an invisible loyalty to father, mother, and there's a mm-hmm. part of us that is missing when we're not able to acknowledge, mm-hmm. I am father, I am mother. And so when whenever children got old enough to go in search of his bio mother, the father had died, she noticed that when the mother and the son were walking away, they had the same gait. Mm-hmm. They walk the same. And how many of you have heard, you sound just like your Uncle George, or you have a mannerism like your Aunt Betsy? We are all of that. And to fragment ourselves and feel like we're separate, it leads to a lot of depression, to anxiety, to separation, to suicide. And so peace is doing our work. And that's what it is.
Given that we're speaking about multiple pieces, mm-hmm. I feel like maybe it's time that we open it up to include yes. others here. So, yes. So I'd like to, we'll continue, but I'd also like to open the floor if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share. Just feel free to. But otherwise, we'll continue. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've had the privilege of participating in one of your circles. Thank you very much. And I know that when hearing the proof is in the pudding, so when you can actually experience it, then you get a much richer embodied sense of the process. I'm also wondering if there might be a really good online video, because I have mm-hmm. some clients I would love to introduce to constellation work. And they can watch this video and maybe a video also that has the natural circle that people.
Mm-hmm. And I have a video on my website that is done, and also looking up other facilitators. And I can give you lists of folks to look up too. Bert Hellinger actually has videos that are online to watch, and mm-hmm. seeing different ways that people do things. Hunter Beaumont is such a sweet man. He has another video online that you can find too. So thank
Will
you.
this be illuminated, or is that?
No, they're open to everyone knowing who and what it is that they represent. Yeah, illuminated have also been called blind constellations, and when I was going to call them blind, friends are like, 3 blind mice, I don't know. But so illuminated is like you get to put the light into where it's dark and illuminate it.
I'd like you to clarify that more. So the difference between an illuminated and a non-illuminated circle is what?
Is that in an illuminated one, people don't know who and what it is that they're represented. And in a non-illuminated one, well, they're both illuminated, but people do know who and what
So they know
representing.
I'm representing that person's
Right.
grandfather, but
Mother.
or mother or whatever, but otherwise I'm standing in and I have no idea who I'm representing.
Right, and what I found when people often know who and what they represent, that they can be like role-playing, and more people have said role-playing, and this is not role-playing, this is like taking in the energy
I
of,
totally can
of
see
what
that.
it is, and get tired of saying, is this the representative or is this you? Well,
Because as much as I don't know anything about your grandfather, I still want to get it right.
right,
And
yeah.
I'm still going to,
Or
in some way, or
I'll
try
do my
to
own grandfather.
Exactly.
Or my mother who
Right.
used to do whatever
Right.
to me. Yes.
So I did have the privilege of participating in the circle, and I was assigned number 2. So it was an illuminated process. I had no clue what role I was playing, what I was being assigned to do. And my question to you, I'm not going to go further with my experience of that because it did become clear exactly who I was representing. But how would you describe that process of discovery in an illuminated?
You mean the discovery of the person who's being the representative, or as a facilitator? Part of it is what I know is that, again, going back to whatever we access, whatever feelings we have, because part of it is, as I say, what sorts of feelings are you having? What sorts of thoughts are you having? Is the person standing next to you, does it feel uncomfortable, or do you want to get closer? So they begin saying, I feel queasy in my stomach. I feel angry. I don't want that person to be next to me. I feel like I'm going to collapse. So slowly as it evolves and unfolds, people begin speaking more. I'd really trust the representative, and I'll say, if this is true, say this. And they'll say, no, it's not true. I'll say, well, what is? Well, this is. And so after a while, they begin totally embodying what it is and who it is that they're representing. I say what because it could be a belief or a concept or a mountain. So does that answer your question? Is that clear?
It does. I wonder if it's clear to people who have not participated.
But I was going to share what came up because Bruce Lipton's being invoked. I was actually just speaking with him last week. I was interviewing him, and we were speaking about his, amongst other concepts, of memory not existing in our brain or even of our body.
Right, yes.
That in a sense it's in the field.
Right.
And that we're like antennas that access that information.
Thank you.
So that's what came up as I was
Yes.
listening, that on one hand, how can I be number 2, but still somehow be obtaining reliable information that there's no way I could know, because I was never told that, and yet somehow I'm the channel for that information, for lack of a better word. And that would be one contextual way to hold that, is that information doesn't just exist within us, it exists in the field that we can all tap into when we get out of the way to
Like we're an
access
open
that.
channel, and if we don't know, if we have no concept, precept, or anything, we just stand there and it's like, whoop, oh yeah, I want to punch your lights out. Or I feel like laughing. I mean, somebody in the constellation we did for the 18 for David, 18 people showed up. There was a part of David that split away because it wasn't safe to be a child. And she had no idea who she was representing. She's like, I want to go out and ride the bike. It's getting dark. I'm afraid I can't do that. And she's all joyful and all happy. She had no idea. So it's just they take it on. And again, I don't know how it happens. And I don't know how to explain it in a way where people would feel safe enough to honor what it is they're feeling as being right. It's not right or wrong, good or bad, it just is. And Yes.
So this is not a question, but it seems to me, not having heard about any of this before, is that you have to not only have a certain amount of trust that you need to do the work, but you also have to have a certain amount of trust that getting into that circle is going to be the right thing for you. And how does a person that is so hurt come to that place?
Yes. Yeah,
Good
thank you.
question.
That's beautiful. And part of it is creating the space. Part of it is, the reason I do the Illuminated is that people can just show up. They don't have to say anything. They can just sit back and watch what's going on. If something triggers in them, I always like to know if they're going to be leaving for whatever reason. And time again for all these years, 90% or so, people have felt safe. And others who haven't felt safe, they've come up to me afterwards and said, I didn't feel safe, and recognizing it's a part of what they're experiencing. Sometimes this group is not for people, so then we work individually, and working individually creates the container to feel strong enough and safe enough to be able to go into, because there are some people I haven't met and we work on the phone, or others just sit with me and we do it through the mind's eye, through that way. So there's many different avenues to access that. And thank you for your vulnerability of asking. Did I answer your question? Okay.
How does it look when you work one-on-one? I've actually never heard of one-on-one constellations, so that's a new paradigm for me. So can you speak more, I guess, just beginning at what that looks like and then into that deeper?
Well, I've really been tapping more and more into my empath and my intuition. I see things. I see patterns, and I listen deeply to when somebody's talking to me. And so I'll take, similar to when we opened with guiding you, we do a guiding like that, and then depending on what it is that they're working on, for instance, if it is father, mother, I ask in your mind's eye to imagine standing in front of you as mother. And then to get an idea of how this person is feeling, I will have them like energetically stick out their hand, and I would say, how tall do you see your mother as she's standing in front of you? And someone who could be arrogant, and that's not said in a nasty way, it's just, we'll put the mother down like that. And that shows me that they're totally out of their place. So part of this work is putting people in their place so that they can take love. So it's going through a process of seeing patterns and of questioning, is this true? No, not quite. And when I'm working with somebody on the phone, we're always walking in a field. This is a constellation. We talked about some heavy stuff, so eyes kind of get, yawns come, because we're working right now. We're doing a constellation in many ways. So since everywhere we walk is the field, is the knowing field, we can be one-on-one, we can be on the phone, we can be within a group. Did that answer?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yes.
I just hadn't heard of it.
Yeah, in fact, when one of the first conferences that came to the States, Constellation Conference down in Portland, Hunter Beaumont, there was a room full of 60 people, and he worked with an Asian man who didn't know his grandparents. He didn't know his place. And so even though there were many people who could stand in as representatives, he did it just one-on-one. And the transformation was beautiful, because again, we see it in the physiology, we see it in the eyes, we see it in the opening, we see it in the movement of getting the fluid going up and down the spine, the way that the soul starts to articulate and bring it in. So yeah.
I liked when you spoke earlier about when people go through the process, it really is a ceremony. And as in many teachings, ceremony is not necessarily meant to be overly shared. Yeah, and held close and worked with it internally. Is that a recommendation when people go through a circle? How do you speak with them about how they step out of the circle? I'm curious.
We clear again, and they take a little part of that circle with them, that sacredness with them, and with sharing as much as they feel would be beneficial, but not enough to take away their experience of what it was that they experienced. And so if they witness, and confidentiality is huge, which we didn't speak about that in here, you know, confidentiality is important. That's the forerunner to safety. And so I shared something. I'll see if it's in the newspaper next week. But it's the deep knowing that it is the gift that we give to ourselves. And what part of us needs to share? Is it the part that doesn't feel heard, and so we need to give more voice to it? Often people want to keep it close to them, and then they watch it unfold through drawing, through journaling, through poetry, through song, through dance. And then people will notice, hey, Craig, I noticed you're a little different there. What's up, dude? You look a little different. It's like, well.
Change my diet.
That's right. And shave my mustache, lost 40 pounds. So it's often with curiosity, people notice with curiosity. And then families, because this is so beautiful, we don't have to have a whole family in the room in order to have shift, because it's part of, it's like a spider web, and it boom, when a little something happens, it reverberates. So hearing stories of, wow, I talked to my brother, it was great, we haven't talked for 20 years, awesome. So those things happen.
Yeah, actually, that just brought up.
And there's order too. So if a child is working, and I speak of children, we're all children because we all have parents. I want my family to live their life different. That is not our place. If we have a younger sibling, we can do a piece of work for the younger sibling because they're younger. But if it's an older sibling, it's not our place unless we want to have a better relationship. So this is not about manipulating at all. It's not manipulating the field. It's opening up to what is. And from there, how do you begin to energetically shift? And then our vibration shifts. So I don't know if it's the work as much as our own vibration shifts, and then we keep radiating more compassion and love, and it shifts things.
I'm sure that you hear story after story, but of somebody finishing a constellation and that other person just changed.
Yes.
I came back, my mom was not the same person she was, and I wasn't any different, but she was some variation, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do I have time to just share one quick story?
Sure.
There was a woman who I met over on Lopez who came in kind of stiff. And I worked with her. Finally, at the end of the day, she said, okay, I feel safe enough to be able to do this work. I haven't addressed this before, but I feel safe. She, at the age of, she had been adopted out when she was very young, and her parents were only 15 and 16 years old. And they loved each other desperately, but the families didn't want them to have the child. So when her constellation was done, there was a lot of rage there towards her bio family because she felt abandoned. So after a while, the love started coming through, and as the months went by, she went back to where she was conceived, found family members who didn't even know who she was, the secret, right? And she created a better relationship with her children. Her arthritic body became looser, and it continues. So those are the kinds of things that are just really wonderful to witness.
Yes, Donna.
How do step-parents, step-grandparents fit into the concept?
Oh, good question.
That's beautiful.
Great question.
Oftentimes when
Actually, can you repeat it just for the audience?
Yes. So how do step-parents and step-grandparents actually fit into a family and feel like they're part of it? Is that what you're asking? So this work works with immediate family, which is father, mother, or immediate family, those who we've married, our children, family origin, father, mother, grandparents. When someone comes into the family, first it's important to honor the ones who have left. So people who have been divorced, it's important to honor whoever left, and many times in our culture they get pushed away, they get talked about, they're negative. When step-parents come in, they come in, if there are already existing children within the system, the step-parent comes in and they actually need to find their place. And it's not stepping in necessarily as being primary parent. It's being respectful of the system that was already created and starting to build the trust and the rapport to be able to infiltrate in. Many times what I see when somebody marries and there's children already involved, the stepmother or father will come in and demand that the children listen, that they cooperate, that they're respectful. And within this context, it's not the place of the children to do that. It's part of the responsibility of the step-parent and grandparent to find their way into the tapestry of an existing family. Does that make sense to you? So it's really coming in again with the honoring. Similar to if a CEO leaves an organization and a new one comes in, it's imperative that you honor the CEO that left and that the new one coming in recognizes where their place is. And it's not, again, a subordination, it's one of respect and dignity and honor. And we can get much farther with that rather than going in forcibly and demanding that I'm looked at, I'm your stepmother, you listen to me. And so
I'm trying to place my only grandmother I knew on my mother's side was a step-grandmother, but her mother was alive and disconnected from her family. So I'm just wondering how that would be placed.
And they're all part of love, and they find their place. I don't believe in broken families. I don't believe that families are not resilient. There are some members within the family that are more resilient than others, and again, it's the interruption of love. And if we all live in the context of one big family, we all have our place. And it's finding where our place is that's honoring the people who have come before us or the ones from another lineage. So it's...
Good question.
Thank you.
Yes?
Would it be all right if I opened some windows?
Sure, it would.
Unless it would make anyone too cold.
Why don't you open one and start with that, and maybe even, if you'd like, to move to the back to be closer to the window?
Yeah.
Whichever. Sure.
It would take 2 windows to get some cross ventilation.
Okay. Thank you, Ross. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
You've done work with corporations. That's
Because again, it's systems. And we often show up in organizations like we did at home. So when I worked out at Brighton Bush, for instance, they were having a water pipe coming through, and it disrupted it disrupted the earth. And so people were really upset that it was creating so much havoc within the community. And so we had a circle to bring resolution to it, to bring more clarity into the invisible patterns that were going on. And even changing the word, rather than a water pipe, it was a lifeline. And so with organizations, we see if we have an organization where the upper is not being respectful of the ones like our children down there, if they're not being honored, if they're not being recognized for what they offer, if they're not feeling significant or respected, they will turn their back, or they will be dysfunctional in ways that are kind of passive aggressive. And so you can work either from the top down or even from the bottom up to work through. And it's amazing because then energetically you're shifting. I've worked with churches where there's been discord. And so it's bringing everybody on the page and seeing where some attention needs to go. Perhaps the board needs to be reevaluated. Perhaps people within the organization need to be told to go because they're instigators, or what is going on with them that they're feeling so resistant. Does that answer your question? It's powerful. It's really beautiful to step into an organization because it is a living organism that is breathing and taking on the energy of who and what it is that's coming forward. And they're not persons, organizations. They're not people. Yes.
I was going to ask Craig, how does EFT fit in with this?
Beautifully, as far as I'm concerned. So the question was, how does EFT fit in with this? I think that the parallels and overlay are impeccable. It's funny, in my mind we have one of our students is a student, her specialty is in working with family estrangement. And I don't know how much she knows about this work, and I'll certainly pass on the video to her. And especially the advanced EFT work of matrix reimprinting is very much stepping into the field to heal the past trauma and utilizing overlay of constellation work, though less formal. So I think that they work incredibly beautifully hand in hand as a synthesis and tool.
And I do EFT with clients that are integrating. Sometimes sitting in the chair, they'll start doing the part to help release the pattern that they're carrying, or drumming something that will shake up the system. And EFT, I think, is just a beautiful merge of coming together of energies.
In a sense, and I know you're not that familiar with this, but the matrix reimprinting work, in a sense, is an internal constellation, often. Because what you're doing with the person is the person that's receiving it is going into state and often resolving issues with family members in the scene. So while you may not have the people physically in the room with you, in a sense, we're bringing them in to find resolution, to find the beliefs that were created, to heal the trauma that was formed. So it's very similar to a one-on-one constellation.
And the weaving together of so many, like you said earlier, so many modalities that are very matched, because it works with the energetics of who we are. And some people resonate more with others. It's not about one being better. It's always interesting being in a room full of healers doing constellation work, and it's please keep your healing mastery out the door, and let's open to the possibility, or merging, because I've also had some healers where we've come together and we've merged services, because it's all about honoring and doing the best for the most.
The funny part, and I was withholding it until she opened that door, is I'm literally right now in the interview process. We're doing the first World Matrix Reimprinting Summit, and the 3 keynote speakers are Bruce Lipton, and speaking about that work, are Rupert Sheldrake in the field work, and Roland McCready of HeartMath.
Wow, yeah.
So those are the 3 openers, so to speak, for the work, which just could be they could be speaking for family constellation in the same capacity.
And HeartMath I got trained in HeartMath years ago, so both as a one-on-one and a group with the Military Appreciation Fund. So HeartMath is very much, and as Greg Braden talks, we feel it in our heart, and that's when the changes happen. And then we put the buoyancy of our words into it to actualize it.
Nicely said.
Sweet, that's exciting for you.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
I interviewed Bruce Lipton years ago. I met him at the country fair down in Eugene. I said,
Yes, he
would
does.
you be on my AM show? He said, sure, call my... So it was great.
Very sweet. We're winding down, so if you do have a pressing question or share, we're coming to that closure. So anything else that, just in sitting back and taking a moment, that we either haven't touched on or that you'd like to make sure that you share? I think you had a piece of poetry, so I just wanted to open that door for anything that was meant to come through before we close.
Well, I did read the poetry.
Oh, I thought you had another.
Wonderful.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to put voice to something that is dear and near to my heart. And I met you. Actually, when I first came to the island, I was putting up flyers because I did circles out at Aldermarsh. And Craig was in the post office and was very gracious. And you even put something on Facebook, which was really nice. I remember things when we're new, it's wonderful to have that connection. So thank you for allowing the space for me to talk about this.